Okay.
Okay. Look, just to begin, when did a career in music, become a career option for you?
Well, my first professional job was when I was barely 14 years old, and it was backing a stripper. And I realized at that point that life as a professional musician might offer more than my piano teacher had led me to believe. So that's really when it happened, I think.
So when you started to get work in the field of production, what was your attitude towards it? Were you looking at it in terms of something to do in the meantime before your career as a musician really took off?
No, I really didn't have much faith in my career as a musician. I thought, God, at one point I thought I'd be a music lawyer. I'm glad that notion
Wow.
passed pretty quickly because those are pretty vile people.
Yeah.
Then I thought I'd be a record producer. I mean, I knew of somebody like Mitch Miller. Not from his sing along with Mitch ventures, but when he was a record producer, when he produced all these Rosemary Clooney and all these pop people, I thought I could do that pretty well. So when I graduated from college, times were quite different, and they sent job recruiters around to colleges, and I got a job as an intern at Columbia Records, which just happened to be Mitch Miller's alma mater. So that's the career I took up.
I guess your first success in the production side of things was Red Rubber Ball by the Circle. Can you remember much of that session, and did you immediately see the hit potential in that recording?
Well, it wasn't my first because I started out as an intern and I learned all the ins and outs of the record company. I spent time in the sales department and in the art department and in the editing rooms, but I was destined. They had to have a destination for me when I finished my internship, and they put me in with Goddard Lieberson Special Products. Now, Goddard Lieberson was the president of the company, a very erudite gentleman, and under his aegis were the original cast albums of Broadway shows, so I assisted with those, and then they started giving me projects to co-produce, like I co-produced some projects with George Avakian, the veteran jazz producer, including Charles Lloyd, the saxophone player, and some other people. And then the first job I had on my own was producing Frankie Yankovic and his Yanks, America's Polka King.
Uh-huh.
And I did 2 albums with them, Movie Time Polkas and Waltzes and Polkas and Waltzes Just for Fun. And then a guy walked into my office who represented himself as Brian Epstein's American associate, quote unquote. And I knew of Brian Epstein's reputation as a Beatles manager, so my ears perked up, and I listened to the demo that he brought in of this band from his fraternity, and it was his college fraternity, and it was the group that later became the Circle, and the song was Red Rubber Ball, and I just, it was the first time I ever originated a project. I had been assigned things, but I never brought anything to the company, so I went into my big boss's big office and sheepishly asked for $3,000 to record this album, and he said, $3,000, I'll give you 5, go ahead. So we did Red Rubber Ball, and that became a hit, and that was it. They gave me an office with a window and a plant after that.
Another early significant involvement of yours was in the film You Are What You Eat. We didn't hear a lot about that movie down here. What can you tell us about your involvement in that?
God, you've heard about that movie down there, really?
Yeah.
I wonder why. I really do. I mean, the movie is really obscure. It started out. Okay, let's see. Peter Yarrow, Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Barry Feinstein, who was a cinematographer and Mary's ex-husband, decided to do this movie that would be a documentary of the Hells Angels. And then, all of a sudden, the summer of love-ins burst upon the scene, and they turned their camera from the Hells Angels to all the love-ins and the wild hippies and all that, and started taking a lot of drugs themselves until the movie became this melange of stuff, reels and reels, cans and cans of film. Now, Peter realized he needed some help with this movie because he was running a full schedule as one-third of Peter, Paul, and Mary. So he asked a friend of his from high school, Ed Kleban. Now, Ed Kleban ended up writing the lyrics to a chorus line, but before that, he was a producer at Columbia Records and my pal, and we used to play tennis together and things like that. So Ed Kleban said, well, maybe John Simon will be the right guy for you. So he took my recommendation, and I was out in California going to the Monterey Pop Festival when Peter said, well, we're on our way to Japan. Why don't you take a little puddle jumper plane up to the first class lounge of United Airlines in San Francisco Airport, and we'll meet and talk about it, and bring me up something that you've done. So I brought up the album I did of Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Massage, which is very, it's really a Dada experience. It's really eclectic and off the wall and scattered and wonderful. And boy, and I have stories to tell about that album too. But so that's the only thing he heard of mine, and he said sure. So when he got back from Japan and I got back from San Francisco, he said, come on up to Woodstock. It was my first time to visit Woodstock. And me and Howard Alk, a film editor, who was a Chicago guy who had just come off the road with Bob Dylan's, Howard was an old friend of Albert Grossman. He just come off the road with Bob Dylan's Don't Look Back tour, and he was a film editor. And so there we were, the two of us, holed up in this rented house with cans of film, and our instructions were to make a movie out of it. So that's the beginning of Eurotweet.
Mm. I guess the band that most people associate you with, of course, is The Band. Do you recall your first impressions of them when you first heard them play? Or can you remember the moment hearing them play for the first time?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, the first time I heard them play was outside of this very house that Howard and I were editing, because it was Howard's birthday, and four of them, Levon hadn't showed up yet. The other four showed up with weird instruments to serenade him in the middle of the night outside of his window, and that's the first I ever met them. And Howard knew that they were looking for a producer, or heard that they were looking for a producer, and the only thing he had ever heard that they had done was on their own was a goofy tape called Even If It's a Pig Part 2. And the tape that they made in the basement that I think Garth actually sang on it. It was just another goof. And the only thing that Howard knew of mine was the McLuhan album, which was also a goof. So he thought the two of us would be great for each other and introduced us. And from that point on, Robbie brought me up to Woodstock after I went back to the city a couple of times just to talk and meet. And then about the third time, Levon had just come back the day before that from working on an oil rig in Louisiana, and the four guys from the band who had been working there played what they'd been working on for me and Levon, and that's the first time I heard their music. And I started working with them on some of the arrangements right there in the basement for the Big Pink album, and we put it all together there, and then we took it, Albert got us some money to do a demo, and so we went and did a demo of about 5 songs, I think, in about 3 hours at the old studio at Columbia Records that I knew so well. And I think 4 or 5 of those songs made it onto Big Pink. So that was the beginning. And yes, I knew they were unique and individual and wonderful and different and exciting and totally competent and great musicians and great singers. So I was delighted to be involved in that project.
The Big Pink album is an album that influenced so many bands and musicians that followed. During the creative process of that album, do you have a sense that you are creating something special, or is it only in the benefit of hindsight that you can look back and judge that?
Well, I knew it was special. I had no idea it would be popular.
Yeah.
I always did special things. I mean, you can tell from the things I've said so far that a lot of the things I did were not run-of-the-mill kind of things, and so I really prized the uniqueness of it, the fact that it wasn't cookie-cutter rock and roll by any means, you know. So I knew it was special and a lot of fun to do, and they were very open as far as things they would try. And the palette of those 3 singers to use as, the 3 different voices, 3 great singers, and Garth's instrumentation and the way the rest of them, played rhythm. And I mean, it was great. It was a great opportunity. We could make a lot of different things out of music there. You know what I mean? And I like making things out of music. That's my passion.
After the success and acclaim of that album, was there an extra pressure on you as producer, or even the band itself, to come up with something as special second time around with the second album?
There always is for every artist who has a hit album. Sure.
Yeah. In general terms, how big an advantage do you consider it being in the role of producer and being a musician yourself?
Ask me that question again, John, without an accent.
Sure. Just in general terms, how big an advantage do you consider it to be as a producer and also being a musician yourself?
Oh, let's see. That's a good question. Well, each producer brings something to a project. You have to there has to be a musical component there. There has to be an engineering component there. There has to be definitely a psychological component there. Every producer has to be somewhat of a psychologist, and there has to be a business component there. My end was music. I always could, bring a musical system of taste, values, bunch of values to bear on a project and help out with musical problems. But I always depended on an engineer to take care of the acoustic and mechanical and electronic ends. And I always, I should more have depended on a business person to shape the project so that it would sell records. I never really paid much attention to that, and maybe I should have done more of that. I know a lot of other producers who would, take their projects to the sales departments of the record companies that they were delivering them to, and say, "What do you think?" And then, what can I do different? But I never really had much rapport with that. I just love being in the studio.
Yeah. Now, I believe it was Paul Simon who was very encouraging of you going out and recording your own music. Would you have proceeded without that stamp of approval from someone of Paul's status?
I know. I must have had an inkling. It must have been easy to tip me over the fence and get me to do that, because once he said that, I just ran with it pretty quickly. I didn't have any reservations about doing that.
You worked with Simon and Garfunkel in the studio on Bookends. How did you observe their working relationship?
Oh, they're such old friends. The working relationship was very smooth, very harmonious. And, there's people, discredit Artie and say that he was unhappy with his role in the duo, but that wasn't the case at all. They had a very happy relationship doing what they do. That's just it. Paul wrote the songs for the most part and played the guitar accompaniment, and the two of them sang. It was a very common thing in the folk era for one person to sing the guitar and both of them to sing. There were a lot of duos that did that in that period. So I don't think there was any friction at all.
Talking specifically about some of the other artists that you've been involved with, how do you approach producing someone like Leonard Cohen? When he came to you, he was pretty much just known as a poet, not so much as a recording artist.
He came to me semi-desperate because John Hammond had signed him, and John Hammond had produced his first session. But then, as Leonard told me, Leonard was staying in the Chelsea Hotel, and a session would be scheduled a month in advance, and he'd show up at the session ready to go, and John would say, "Oh, I don't feel too well today. I'd like to reschedule the session. It'll be scheduled a month later." So Leonard went to Columbia and said, "I need another producer." So they gave him to me.
Talk about recording Janice Joplin with Big Brother. Janice being a performer of great stage presence, how do you go about bringing out the best in her in a recording studio when a lot of it was very much based on her visual presence on stage?
Well, that's tricky. We tried to do a live album we tried to record Cheap Thrills as a live album, but it isn't a live album. The only song on it that's live is, I think, Ball and Chain. Everything else was faked. We did it in the recording studio and added an audience, and because people were craving a live album. Everybody said, "We want a live album for Janice. We want a live album." And we tried a live album, and they just hadn't made too many mistakes. And you can make a mistake in a live situation, and it can be forgotten 30 seconds later. But on a record, mistakes live forever. So we had to go in the studio and try to do a mistake-free recording.
Of course, she was known for her erratic lifestyle. How was she to work with in the studio? Was there any difficulty there?
She was a pisser. Yeah. Because she was a warm, sweet person, but she could be tough. She could be a real pisser, and she and I had our, beat our heads. We had our bumps, but she also was having bumps between herself and the band, because it became apparent in the studio, probably because of me and my expecting more out of them, that they weren't quite able to do what we wanted them to do. So she was on their case pretty strong, and she was tough. Janice was tough. She was an acceptable performer, and she could be a nice person, but I can't say that everything was smooth as silk in the studio with Janice. No.
Yeah, which I guess leads to my next question. How much of the job of producing is technical, and how much is more concerned with the psyche of the artist that you're working with?
Well, like I said before, every record producer has to be a psychologist.
Yeah.
There are basic things like the person who writes a song knows the song so much better than everyone else in the studio, and so their optimum performance in the studio will probably be on their second take of the song. Everybody else is learning the song to some degree, so each one of them is going to have an optimum take at some different point. So it's up to the producer to pace everybody in just the right way. If the artist, you can see the artist has already laid the song out for the other players once, then you let the artist go. Tell them to go in the control room or go leave the building and come back in a couple hours. And meanwhile, I would teach the song to the other guys. And so they got up to snuff, and they felt more and more and more comfortable with it. The artist would come back, and the other ones would be so much more advanced than when the artist left. And then they would work it all out together. This is just typical, Then they'd work it all out together, and then we would take a big break, go out for dinner or go quit for the day, come back the next day, whatever it is, and then come in and record the song when everyone was rehearsed. Pre-production is so important in making a record, and making a record seem spontaneous and live and wonderful, Unless it's one of these layered records where you layer every element on one at a time, which is not what I really like to do. It's a different art form,
Now, someone you would have come in contact with during those peak years would have been Albert Grossman. What kind of operator was Albert?
Come in contact with. He was my manager. Albert was the superstar manager. He was the best. All the other guys wore suits and ties and looked nice and establishment looking. Albert looked like a very large edition of Benjamin Franklin. He had a long ponytail out the back. I know a great Australian story. I guess I can tell it because Albert's dead. Dylan was playing in Australia on one of his tours. I guess this original Don't Look Back tour, and the narcotics police came to the hotel room, and they suspected that Dylan had drugs, and they made a thorough search of the area. And Albert had a big block of hash on his head underneath his hat the whole time he was talking to them and showing them around. Albert had incredible balls.
Yeah.
He was very, in other words, confidence. He was wonderful that way. Another thing about Albert, which was tricky, was I don't know anybody with whom he had a contract, a piece of paper. And that was not good. It was sort of like a Big Daddy scene. You know, all these bands were living around Woodstock, Butterfield's band and the band, and all the guys who were in Ian Sylvia's band, and whoever else would pass him through out of his stable, and living there. And whenever any of us needed money, we'd go to Albert and say, "Hey, Albert, we need some money," and he'd give us some money. But consequently, money, there was never an accurate accounting of what was really owed us.
Mm.
So a lot of us got fucked. And whatever, that's water under the bridge, and I don't get an ulcer about it.
Mm. When you started recording your own music, putting out your own records, was there any point where you were in a bit of a career dilemma of which path to go down, the production side or your own career as a musician?
Well, since my records were no more than critical hits and weren't big popular hits, there was not much deciding to make. I mean, I wasn't making any money from them, and I had a day job as a record producer. That was my day job, so I kept up with that.
Yeah. How important have you found it to be actually a fan of the performer or band that you're producing? Is it possible to successfully produce a record for someone that you're not necessarily a fan of their music?
Gee, I don't think so.
No.
No. I don't think I've ever done anybody like that. Oh, there was one actor which will remain nameless. That my manager before Albert was my manager said, "You got to do this act because reason," and I said, "Okay, I did it," but we didn't see eye to eye at all, and the record wasn't very good in the end, and I never would do that again.
You worked on the first Blood, Sweat and Tears album with Al Kooper. Fantastic record. It stands up so well today. How do you think that band would be looked back on now had it continued on that path rather than the path that eventually went down?
I don't know. I really don't know. Do you think there's a big difference between the original path and the path they eventually went down?
Well, they certainly went. Don't you?
No.
Oh.
The only thing was they added a powerful vocalist in David Clayton Thomas, but everything else is, Spinning Wheel is, One Child Born to Carry On, and those things. They seem to be in the Blood, Sweat and Tears mold that we were doing in the first album. You know, it's same as I can't think of titles anymore. You know, You Made Me More Than You'll Ever Know, and those titles. They seem to be in this. There were some more adventurous things, I guess, in the first album, some of the things that Al Kooper wanted to do, the Further Adventures of Plato, Diogenes, and Freud, or whatever that was called. But also, they stayed adventurous, like in that when they do that Billie Holiday song. You know the song I mean. They break up, they change the rhythm in the middle and go into a swing rhythm after doing it as blues ballad in the beginning. So they stayed adventurous, you know. I don't know. I think that they progressed logically, whether they changed members or not, you know.
Did you have a policy at any time of not wanting to play on the albums that you were actually producing?
Generally, I wanted to play on the albums I wanted to produce, especially to arrange. I arranged an awful lot of the music, not only the added instruments, but the rhythm sounds and the rhythm patterns. I've arranged a lot of the band stuff, and I always want to get involved. I would much rather be on the musician side of the glass than the engineer side of the glass.
Yeah. If you had to choose...
the answer is yes, I always want to play.
If you had to choose one album, putting aside the obvious ones that we've probably already discussed, are there any albums that you're in particularly proud of that perhaps never received the recognition that you felt?
Sure, I can rattle off a few.
Yeah.
John Hartford's Morning Bugle.
Mm-hmm.
And that was done without listening to any playbacks. Just John and the guitar player Norman Blake and the great jazz bass player Dave Holland playing bluegrass for the first time. That was a wonderful album. Gordon Lightfoot's album, Did She Mention My Name, where I overdubbed a whole bunch of strings and winds after we did the basic tracks. Michael Franks' album Tiger in the Rain, where I did all the charts, I used to use that for my arranging demo. Steve Forbert's Jackrabbit Slim album, all of which was recorded live, not a single overdub.
Wonderful album. Yeah, I was just listening to that yesterday, in fact.
Uh-huh. Well, we're gonna reissue that album. Steve and I were just talking about that because the album had a beautiful clarity and transparency of sound when we recorded it. But then when we went to master it, Steve brought in the Rolling Stones album, Between the Buttons, whatever album was prevalent at the time, said, I want our album to sound as hot as this. Well, in order to do that, you had to compress the crap out of his beautiful, transparent sound. And that's what's released. That's what's out there. So we think we've located the original tapes from the Nashville sessions before they were compressed. And we want to release those somehow, because they sound so wonderful. You can feel, you can really hear that everyone's in the same room at the same time. Somehow, it doesn't, it's wonderful. Let me see, other albums. That's a bunch, isn't it?
Yeah. Is there
another one? One more I got to mention is Herth Martinez. I did 2 albums with Herth Martinez, if you know who that is. You can just check those out. Herth's a wonderful guitar player and songwriter and singer. And I did all the charts for those things. And one of them was only released in Japan, called Not Like I Was Before. That just came out about, 5 years ago. That's really a good one. Not Like I Was Before, Herth Martinez. There we go. That's a pile of them.
Yeah. Is there any artist or band that you've never had the opportunity to produce that you would have liked to, that you felt you could?
That's a question. That's a question that people have always asked me from the beginning of time. Yeah. And the first time anybody asked me that, not the beginning of time, was about the time Fleetwood Mac's Rumors album came up. And I listened to that album and I said, the songs I like best on this album are written by Christine. And I said, okay, I'd like to produce Christine McVie, whatever her name, Christine Perfect, whatever her name was at the time.
Yeah.
And so that's the only answer I've ever given to that, though I've never met her, anything like that. But there are probably lots of people I'd like to produce Dr. John. And I wanted, Richie Havens and I were talking about doing something before he passed on. I'd like to do, I play all the time with Taj Mahal, but I've never produced anything with him. I'd like to do that. Because I love him as a person too, and I love his music. A lot of these things have to do with loving the person, and really getting along with them. Because you're locked up in a studio for months with these people, and you got to get along, So
sure,
you've got to like the music.
And John, just before I let you go, upcoming plans. What can we look forward to from you?
Well, I've been doing more personal appearances. Finally, I'm doing a solo show at the Savannah Music Festival this year in Georgia, next month, or March it is, and that's a big deal for me because that's a real special festival. It is very cross-cultural. They invite classical music stars and bluegrass stars and blues and jazz people, and somehow through my good friend, an agent, my good friend Bobby Cudd, he got me into that festival, and so I'm really excited about doing that. And the last things that I've done have been combinations of me doing my songs and telling stories about, questions that you've been asking, things like that. So that's a nice combination. And I also am looking forward to doing living room concerts. I don't mind playing and singing my songs for 10 people in a living room. I don't need 3,000 people in an auditorium. And so that's become a very prevalent movable venue here in the States, living room concerts. So I've got this young man, I say young, he's younger than I am, he's 30 years old, who's sort of taken himself on as my de facto manager. And he wants to get me doing living room concerts. So I'm fine with that,
Fantastic.
Yeah, so that's it. I get calls from people every once in a while to produce, but most of what I hear is it's not really new, or if it is new, it's not really my cup of tea.
Yeah.
But usually they call me because they think that they sound like the band or something of that era, something in the Americana bag, or like Dylan or something. So,
Yeah.
but they do sound like a band like Dylan, but they don't sound like themselves or anything really special. There was a wonderful band that some guys who, the real kids, they were in high school, and they were called the Garbage Men, and they sent me their stuff, and I listened to it, and I loved it because they did all their stuff out of homemade instruments, instruments that were made out of scrap plastic and junk and boxes, and but they made actual real music, So the concept of them being, ecologically sound as the Garbage Men and being such young kids, and that was something I wanted to do. But instead, they went off to go to college to be doctors and lawyers and things like that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff out there. So.
Mm. So in terms
Anyway,
of producing, you're very selective in what you take on these days.
I always have been, man. I always have been.
Yeah. All right, John, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your major contribution to music that's living with us forever. And
I'm glad to do it, John. What form is this interview going to show up in?
Radio. It'll be a 2-hour radio special.
You have taped this, have you?
Yep, all recorded, ready to go. Yeah.
You didn't tell me that. No, you can't use it. Well, tell everybody in Australia that I'd be glad to come there. All I got to do is pay for my plane ticket and the hotel, and I'll be there.
No worries. We'll be here waiting for you.
Okay, John. Nice to talk to you, man.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.